Master Xeon. Can you hear us?
Oh yeah, I'm right here.
Hey man, actually we got to give you actually a lot of credit. The current project that Lawson has us working on has had us using your HardOps quite a bit, man, and it is it is a thing of gold. So we got a little bit of time here before I believe Blender PDX and Javillion get going. Did you want to do a presentation, kind of talk about stuff?
Oh yeah, no problem. All right, so everybody can see my screen. So I always tell people in advance that in my Blender.
Screen share. The button's down here somewhere for it again.
Oh, I'm not screen sharing.
Yeah, big green button.
Now I'm screen sharing.
Now we can see it.
Yeah, we can.
All right, awesome. Let's see if I can move this window to another monitor. Move this window to another monitor. All right, so now y'all can see my screen.
Yeah. Maybe just do a little intro. There's a lot of people online, so just to, you never know who's.
Oh yeah, no problem. So for everybody who doesn't know, I'm MasterXeon1001. I'm like a indie 3D artist. Also have a YouTube channel that at this point I would say most people I think are familiar with, especially if they're into robots. I have over 500 videos. Also have a an art station where you can see all the stuff that I'm working on. But for the most part, I've been pretty caught up in the developments of this plugin called HardOps, which is basically a hard surface plugin for Blender that's been a universal team effort involving all sorts of interesting Blender users and helping me develop it. In fact, for people that are actually using it, going from version 006 to 007, I was able to convince Jacques Luck, who's the guy making the animation notes for Blender, to get on board and join the team to assist with changing things. And the guy's actually so great at Python coding that I designated him to codename the Python, because he just taps on code and just changes things. So this latest version has definitely been leaps and bounds over the old one, with many of the tools getting a rewrite. So, usually the later people are using HardOps, the less enthusiastic I am. Like when people are like, yeah, I just bought it. I'm like, well, you missed out on all the cool stuff, because icons was an adventure. Panels was an adventure. Pie menus were an adventure. And collaborating with all these different people when I have no understanding of Python and putting together this plugin that's being sold to people has definitely been an experience. I want to go back over the code afterwards and just kind of do a retrospective explaining to users how the code has basically evolved over the process of making this plugin, because as we have used it, it has also gotten better and changed, and the behaviors have evolved. But the basic idea is that whenever you go into Blender and let's say we're making a hard surface mesh, just real quick. We'll just take this one for instance, close the asset manager, and we were to just take this mesh, it's real simple, nothing fancy, and smooth it, it's going to look a little bad. And so, the way that you can deal with that is you can go over under your object settings and turn on auto smooth, set your angle to 60, that'll take care of it. And then the next thing you would do after that is you would go and put a bevel modifier on. If you barely started using Blender yesterday, you will leave it on none, but anyone who knows better will know that this is beveling every single vertex, which no one on planet Earth would ever want. So you would change it to angle, set it to 30, lower to width, and that would be it, right? And that's just the start. However, that's a large amount of tools to have to jump between, because it gets even more complicated. For example, for the angle, you really wouldn't want it to be angled. You would want it to use the weight. However, whenever it comes to specifying the weight, going in edit mode and selecting every single edge that you want to be beveled is a bit of a tedious process, and nobody would want to do that either. So Blender actually has an option here under select where you can select sharp edges. I don't know why some of my letters are missing, but maybe today's not the day for K's. We'll go ahead and select sharp edges, and notice that all the edges have been highlighted that are basically sharp over the 30-degree threshold. So real quickly, we can go into the Control E menu and set the bevel weight. And we can also go into Control E menu and mark it as sharp. And we can also go into Control E menu and set the crease. So if this sounds like a lot of work, it totally is. And that's basically the reason that HardOps exists, is because instead of having to go through all of these functions that I just went over, we can say, take a mesh and just run a function called sharpen. Sharpen will simply do all the stuff that I mentioned, with the exception of adding a bevel modifier. But then the tool begins to get more tricky due to the more advanced behaviors of the additional sharpeners. So, like I said, it's been a joint effort, but over the process of learning Blender, my strategy has been to locate people who are better at Blender than me and basically become friends with them to, of course, learn their trade secrets and secret recipes. So over the course of discussing hard surface, it became apparent that this would need to become some sort of process. So now you see that I'm actually booleaning into the shape and calculating the sharps as I go. And so without having to stop to do anything, I'm able to continuously work without having to deviate to do any sort of cleanup or clicking parameters. In fact, my goal for Blender is to work without any UI whatsoever. A lot of people I talk to, who look at Blender from the outside, they're like, that UI is so bad. It's like, what are you talking about? You're coming from 3ds Max. How dare you come talk to me about my UI? Moto's not so much better. It has a big old plane that's slapping you in the face all the time. So, when it comes to Blender, being able to press Alt F11 and Alt F10 for basically full screen mode and God mode is the way to work. I mean, and my goal is to basically make it where you can work this way without having to deviate. So there's also options for symmetrize in edit mode. If you go under the W menu, there's an option for symmetrize, which in my case, you see I've mapped to Shift-Alt-X. Symmetrize doesn't actually exist in object mode. So in HardOps, we have an object mode symmetrize that I have mapped to Alt-X. Basically, to map something, you can right-click it and change your shortcut. So by pressing Alt-X, I can quickly just mirror things over and continue working, further adding to the speed and workflow of Blender. But one of the greatest experiences I can say over the course of using Blender has definitely been with the scripting, like modeling, compositing. All that stuff is great, but scripting is really where you can make this program yours, because there's so much that you can change for you as a person, and the stuff that maybe the developers aren't so keen on because they're following a different vision. I completely trust the vision of Master Tan, the guy that runs the whole show. However, there are always things that can be tweaked to your liking depending on your line of work. For animators, I know that you could definitely create animation pies that would be able to utilize the graph editor a lot quicker. In fact, I have a really large obsession with reducing the amount of clicks that it takes to do things on the computer. In fact, I tell people every click is one step closer to the grave, right? In fact, since I've used Blender, I've probably killed about 15 mice. Just killed them cold. I click hard. Menus better start moving, or else I'm going to click it again. So you definitely want to utilize your time well whenever you're modeling and creating things, so you're not just experimenting and putting yourself in a hole. So I'm actually quite obsessed with the educational aspect of Blender as well. So, if any of you follow my channel, I'm quite committed to educating the Blender community, because I do definitely believe that this is a fine software with amazing potential. However, some of the misunderstandings in the software paradigms and tool behavior may get lost and disorient users. So the goal is to definitely, create a tool that keeps the same Blender paradigms that they have, such as modal operators, F6 menus, and things that people are used to with all the rest of their tools, while also taking things that are completely separate and combining them together in order to reduce said keystrokes. So basically, you see me going through and using a series of operations to cut this cube up, adding inserts. In HardOps, there's an insert collection that's added here for users just to insert, to just go willy-nilly with. If you're just, because if you're making a robot, chances are no one's going to stop you and ask you at the end, hey, where'd you get that bolt from? If you stop me and you ask me where I get that bolt from, I'm not going to respond to you. I'm going to move on to the next question. But we also have these inserts that are basically called subsets. And these are, similar to a particular type of brush that you can find in this program called Moi, which is what inspired this particular addition to HardOps. And basically, it's just a brush that digs into the surface. However, with the asset management system, the goal is definitely to take it in a direction that's so unique that other programs can't emulate it. In fact, when it comes to insert brushes, Maya has an asset management system. Moto has an asset management system. Pretty much every 3D program has an asset management system. ZBrush has insert brushes. They have insert curves. They have curve brushes. They have all sorts of tools with additional levels of versatility. And not to say that Blender's falling behind by any means. This just means that there's tools that we can create that other programs aren't simply able to have. For example, ZBrush isn't able to do animation. So there's a type of insert that we're working on that is basically an animatable insert. It's like an insert that you insert into the surface, and the insert will animate perpetually. But it's still something that we're working on. But basically, you'll stick it in the surface, and then if you render it out and animate it at the end, it'll just have like machinery going on. But the goal is to kit bash and idealize robotics and make it a fun process that doesn't require a whole lot of leg work. And error. As far as this mesh goes, a lot of people always ask, how's the mesh at the end? The mesh is exactly as you would expect. I cut a bunch of damn booleans in it. So it's going to, of course, be a little bit of a mess. However, even with that happening, you still have quite a bit of versatility you can go through here. In fact, if we look at this mesh is a perfect example of the absolute most minimal working mesh for me to get this into a production style render that's very nice without having to go through retopology and all of that. If you ever tried to retopologize bevels, you'll definitely understand. But if we look at this, the geometry itself has a lot that you can learn from it. For example, this edge right here is skewed. It should go this way. If it goes this way, then this bevel will behave more perfectly. That is the most minimal thing we can do to actually get this working. So right here, I'll just select. What I did was I selected one point, selected the other point, and I pressed J, which will do a direct lightning bolt, basically, like a direct knife between 2 points, in case you didn't know. And we'll just dissolve that. So as a result, this bevel will behave a lot better. And this is like cleanup. So you don't even have to do this. It's just if you don't do this, it can stack up on you. But the more cleanup you actually do, the more you can get away with. So I actually do just a little bit of cleanup, a little bit of Boolean, a little bit of cleanup, a little bit of Boolean, and then just take it all the way to the end. And then, these are, for personal work and just me just getting ideas across. It's not like I'm giving these to clients. If it was for a client, obviously it'd be to their parameters. But we're talking about just the process of just making something real quick just to just make something. The goal is to get people to just create. Like I also have students as well, since I do mentoring. And, one of the things I always discuss with them is, doing what we call crunches, which is, little time struggles where you work for a brief period of time to accomplish a small goal. At the end of that time frame, you don't return to the project. You're not going to dwell on it. It's just you just coming to terms with just your workflow and your technique. So you're just basically practicing. So, right here, this piece is now cleaned up enough. So as a result, I can now increase the bevel width even further. So there's still a lot of things that could possibly be done with this particular tool to make it better. However, as far as my needs go, it definitely does the job. We even have the ability to select materials, which in my case, I have a sphere on my final layer that actually has a ton of materials on it that are just my favorites. So whenever I'm just working in a quick fashion, I can just just slap materials on things and continue working. But as you can see, this entire time I've been in full screen mode. I still haven't yet pressed Alt F11, which is my goal. In fact, I accidentally turned on display ingons and tries, which is another feature. So if you are into cleaning up, you can turn on display ingons and tries, and red faces means you got some things you probably need to fix. However, there's also, of course, even ways around that. If you're wondering how are you going to UV such an in-gun covered mesh, we even have tools under the mesh tools for basically unwrapping these meshes if you're the type of guy that's into sending them out to Quixel or using a Substance Painter. But since I began experimenting with those as well with this, I've found that baking is a much better option. In fact, whenever it comes to baking software, Blender does baking. However, I would definitely recommend against that. But there's also XNormal, which is a completely free program that bakes normals very well. But I can't stress enough that Blender's normal baking is something that causes me a little bit of issue when it comes to game engines like Unity and Unreal, especially compared to the bakes that you get out of Substance Designer. So even though I'm a complete Blender loyalist, I also preach to people that it's important to probably use the best tool for the job, especially if that job is your food and your life and your time. You definitely don't want to, you don't want to be a Blender fan, of course, for the wrong reasons. Me personally, I'm a fan of the software because it's fast, it loads quick. You can load like 15 instances of Blender. Back when I was trying to learn 3ds Max, it would take so long to open Max that I would forget why I was opening Max, and then Max would just pop up and hit me in the face like a sack of bricks. It's like, why is Max here? Get out of here, Max. So, that's like my motto, get out of here, Max. Nobody wants you, but not to be bashing other software, but, definitely always use the best tool for the job. So whenever it comes to baking, I'm a big proponent of Substance Designer / Substance Painter. It's a quite affordable suite. They also work with the indie artists in mind. So that's definitely up my alley. However, texture painting in Blender is also good as well. However, being able to paint multiple material layers at once is also quite an interesting development whenever it comes to the world of texture painting. But whenever it comes to using new tools, it's something that I talk to a lot of people about, and they're like, I just haven't got around to it yet. I'm making plans next weekend to learn this tool. Right now, it's not a good time. I'm depressed. My cat is sad, or whatever the case may be. And me personally, I definitely have quite the opposite idea, since time is definitely money, and you definitely want to utilize your time to the best of your ability. So if there's something that definitely does the job better, not talking about 3D, of course, don't abandon Blender ever, not talking about that. There's nothing better, already checked. But whenever it comes to the other parts of your job, just like the previous presenter was talking about using Newt, now I have to press Alt F11 because I'm stuck. So now I'm going to go ahead and use Andrew Price's Pro Lighting plugin. And I was so fortunate as to be able to beta test it whenever he was testing it. He released it for $100, which kind of made me a little sad. It's kind of a lot, especially since Blender people are struggling to still get professional acknowledgement. So it's definitely important to not leave up paywalls that are too high to prevent people from wanting to actually jump on board. But that's also advice I give to everyone as well. I've taught a lot of people Blender, and a funny thing is, usually the first thing they'll say is, I got to go tell everybody in the world about Blender. And I always laugh, and I'm like, no, definitely don't go do that. So many people do that. Don't go do that. People probably already know. So just, I've almost come to a conclusion to just let people discover how awesome the program is on their own terms, because eventually they'll get back to me and they're like, I never realized that your program actually loads so fast, or what a GPU render means. Whenever it comes to Blender and its render, the render is no joke. I recently bought Octane, which Octane is even less of a joke, but Cycles is ridiculous. I mean, if you're rendering hard surface objects, it's just amazing. I mean, I just sit here, just let the cycles stack up, and come back and fall in love. Make a sandwich, come back, and I drop my sandwich because the render is looking so awesome. Whenever it comes to Blender, I definitely also recommend checking out commercial add-ons, especially the ones in the Blender market and elsewhere, since they do offer things that definitely aren't normally offered by Blender itself. So, I almost look at HardOps as almost a proposal for what I am asking that they do with hard surface modeling as far as Blender is concerned. So hopefully by 0.1, it'll be further perfected to be like a perfect presentation to explain, hey, this is how I approach it. But another perfect example is there's a guy who made this add-on called lens flares. So I'm just going to stick my camera right here with Control-Alt-Numpad-0, which will just slap your camera into view. And we're going to go ahead and just enable lens flares. But before that, we have to put a empty in the scene. So I'll just choose a sphere as my empty, and I'll press W so I can change my draw size in the view. We'll move it off the object so I can see it in front of the camera. So this will be my lens flare basically. So normally you add your lens flares in the in the compositor. However, this interesting tool lets you add it in the render mode. And the guy that made it, I can't even remember his name offhand. If I knew I was going to be mentioning it, I would have actually looked it up. But Flare Wizard is in the Blender market. I would definitely recommend checking this thing out. Like, it's just a fun time. So you could just come in here, add lens flares, add dirt to the camera, and just move it around. In fact, with this same empty here that's also controlling the lens flare, if you're wondering how this lens flare is, it's literally a 2D image being put over the camera. It's like really crazy how it works. It's pretty amazing in my opinion. In fact, if you do pick it up and you end up with an issue where the transparent layers aren't showing and they turn black, just keep in mind that under sampling, you can also, light pass. Under light pass, you can raise your transparent samples and it'll work. But for mine, I happen to not be using so many sampling layers that it turns black. But that was something that I saw a lot of people comment on, so just mentioning that offhand. So, even with this, I can select the camera. The camera appears to be hidden. We'll select it, move it back to layer 1. Usually layer 0 is my garbage layer. Before I give my files out or save them for good, I'll delete all this stuff, but I just put all my crap on 0, just M0, just puts it there. And that's that. So now with the camera selected, another interesting feature of HardOps that has been added is if you have the camera selected and you press Q, you have camera options now. So if you check this box, it'll lock the camera to view so you can perfect your camera layout. Like I said, full screen ideas is the plan here. You can also turn this thing up, which just makes the outer area black. The depth of field target, in our case, we'll just choose empty. I guess this is called empty 00, or it's called empty regular. So let's just go ahead and EMPTY. So there we go. So now our depth of field target is set to the empty. And going back into the Q menu, I can even set the aperture to like 0.2. So that's the same as if I go on the camera options and I set the 0.2 here. Usually 0.2 is like immediate depth of field, So if you're trying to just get that, that soapy prom style render going, just take your empty and stick it off the model. But a little depth of field always goes a long ways. However, you can see that it also blurs out my lens flare. So I'm going to have to pick between the two. And in this case, we're just going to go with the lens flare. But I guess to fix that, I could have put it on a separate render layer. But, live and learn. So we place this here, and it's almost there. To be honest, to have a lens flare, there would need to probably be like a light. So we'll just put a light here. I'll select the light, select the empty, Control P. Whenever it comes to learning Blender, I always remind people that the hotkeys have something to do with the buttons. P is parenting, so Control P, Alt P has something to do with parenting. Control P is parenting, Alt P is unparent. So in some universe, that technically makes sense. G for grab makes sense in an alternate universe. S for scale, R to rotate. V to rip makes no sense in no universe. Y to separate makes no sense, but it's shortcut in edit mode. Kind of think of it. Some of the shortcuts do make sense, but some of them don't. But that was how it was for me to remember it. L is to select link. Control L is for linked options. So that does make sense. Sometimes I'm using a Blender and I'll have an aha moment, and I'm just like, these crazy Blender users, I finally got it. It turned out that I just wasn't thinking right, or I was approaching it like an Autodesk user. So, for when it comes to Blender as well, I must also throw in that it's harder to learn Blender, in my opinion, if you come from another package than it does just starting out. When I first picked up Blender, I literally closed it like the first 10 times I opened it. I was like, that program does not look like Microsoft Paint at all. Like, I'm not using that at all. Like, I closed Blender literally every time I opened it. I knew I wanted to use Blender, but my mind did not want to be involved with what Blender was presenting me. And this was during the 2.4, 2.5 era was when I jumped on. I started in 2010 for some context. But whenever I first picked it up, I did not want to get into it. So my goal also is definitely to change that user experience. But starting from other programs, it's even worse because you'll come over to Blender and you're like, WER isn't moving, rotating, and scaling like Autodesk and ZBrush and Modo and everything else under the sun. I can't do this. But I always tell people, like I don't go to your house and eat your food, but I tell you to use my plates. Instead, I'm going to go to your house and I'm eat your food on your plate. So when you come into Blender, don't change the hotkeys to Maya. Just learn it the way that the developers intended it, because you're bound to encounter some pitfalls. Not to mention, every Blender tutorial you'll ever see will completely not be applicable to you because you're using a silo workspace or like something modified. So, I think that'll wrap it up for my presentation. Unless I still have time, then I could go on even more. But
Awesome. Thank you. It was like a whirlwind tour of HardOps.
Oh, thanks. I didn't rehearse that.
Really, actually, it was brilliant. Yeah, really cool.